Good afternoon and welcome to the SIP Power Hour Lunch, brought to you by our host, Adrian Shropshire from Black Pack, Judith Brown Dianas from the Advancement Project. And, you know, it's summertime, so you're going to start seeing us rotate. So Judith was out, and then now our girls, Tracy Sturdivant from the League and Fatima Goss Graves from the from the National Women's Law Center. I'm just going to assign them to other organizations. They're taking some much needed time off. They're probably going to be in the comments like Judith was.
Yeah, I know, right?
Not on camera, but participating. But welcome, and I'm Glenda Carr from Higher Heights, and welcome to the SIP Power Hour Lunch. As you know, we gather twice a week to center Black women in our politics, our issues, our policies, and our culture. And so today we have gathered a group of amazing policy makers and policy leaders to have a conversation about all things going on with Washington. So, you know, there's some bills that have been introduced. There's sessions maybe, and so I think everybody's a little confused on what's happening, particularly as it relates to how are we going to protect all Americans, but particularly the most vulnerable during the pandemic, and as it relates to stimulus checks and unemployment. And so we are going to get started. We hopefully will have some time to talk about hot topics because there's a lot happening. But I am so excited to be in conversation with Congresswoman Yvette Clarke. So she's not quite my congresswoman. She's a couple of streets over, but at the end of the day, she is a sister, friend, a supporter of Higher Heights, actually one of our founding circle members, family, by extension of us both being Jamericans, and one of the leaders down in Washington, bringing her unique voice. She sits in Shirley Chisholm's historic seat in Brooklyn, and is currently the only Black woman in the New York delegation. She's also one of the co-chairs of the Caucus of Black Women and Girls. So today we're going to talk a little bit about what's happening in Congress, and particularly putting a lens on it as relates to how it will and can impact Black women and girls, and what do we need to do as Black women to ensure that our voices are heard as they make these important decisions before they recess for the summer. And so before that conversation happens, tell us, where are you watching from? What city, what state, what part of the house? I decided to come outside because I'm on the Eastern Seaboard and we had a storm yesterday. And so I am not even on my internet is out, but my power is on, praise God. And so same place outside is where I am. And please share this. As you know, we are streaming live on our new channel at the SIP, on Facebook, on Instagram, and on YouTube. So we need you to continue to help grow our SIP community. So please share this important conversation. So welcome, Congresswoman Yvette, actually D. Clarke, to be exact, to the SIP. This is her, she is a regular and has been able to come on and update us. So first let's start out, how are you doing? Go ahead. We both celebrated something important in our culture, as you can see that Jamaican flag, but how are you doing?
I'm doing very well, Glenda, and let me thank you and the women of the SIP for inviting me to share in this power luncheon today. Let me say that I am currently located in my home in central Brooklyn, New York, in my makeshift state studio / library. And you know, it's good to be home, to have you know, a real direct link and contact with what is happening on the day-to-day. We are currently in recess in the House of Representatives, subject to the call of the chair. We have not recessed for the month of August yet. We are expected to be given 24-hour notice to return to DC to make sure that we finish the people's business in passing what we're all anticipating will be a very substantive stimulus bill, well, otherwise known as the HEROES Act.
Great. And share a little bit about what you think what is in the House bill. And I know that everyone is in discussions around the leadership. So from the leadership in the House and in the Senate, and there's obviously some conversations with the administration about what do we think, is likely to be put forward and can be moved to protect Americans, but particularly Black women.
But let me say this, that we are very fortunate in the House of Representatives to have so many Black women in leadership roles in the body, that, every piece of legislation that leaves the House of Representatives has the imprint, has the intention, and the lived experiences of Black women and girls baked into it. There is no doubt that the recognition of Black women's leadership not only is resident in the House of Representatives, but I think that it comes from the fact that Black women outside of the legislative body have been well represented in every sphere of social influence that there is. And given that recognition, it really amplifies the voices of a chairwoman like Congresswoman Maxine Waters, chair of the Financial Services Committee, the voice of Congresswoman Eddie Bernice Johnson, chairwoman of the Science and Technology Committee. And, we can go down the list. Congresswoman Barbara Lee, who is in leadership in our steering and policy and an appropriator in the House of Representatives. So, we are well represented in the product that was the HEROES Act. First being our concern for hazardous occupations that Black women work in. And so the idea of hazard pay is baked into this legislation for our frontline and essential workers. Primarily, we know we are overrepresented in nursing and hospital staffing, where we're truly on the front lines. And so hazard pay for those who have worked in those extremely vulnerable occupations when it comes to actually tending to COVID patients. We know that it's critical that hazard pay be provided. For some, that will mean that will give them the latitude to self-quarantine if need be, to make sure that their families are set, their children are going back to school in some form of fashion. So being able to prepare for that, which is costly in a pandemic, everybody's being price gouged to death. But the bill also deals with the unemployment insurance crisis that we're facing across this country, the crisis created by the folks in the Senate who don't share our values, who felt like a bump of $600 additional to unemployment checks was too much money, that it was creating a laziness among those who are unemployed. Well, you're unemployed by virtue of the fact that there aren't jobs, right? That your job has been either killed by the virus, literally, or you're unable to find a new position commensurate with your skills and ability in a job market that is shedding jobs, and that where we're seeing a contraction of the gross domestic product. In addition to that, we are concerned about, of course, those who rent and those who are behind in mortgages right now. And we know Black women are always represented in the housing market in one form or fashion. We were hit hardest by the financial meltdown. And so, we are really looking at how we take care of women and their families in that space. In addition to that, municipal and state and municipal governments, that's a critical part of this bill, because we know that, again, Black women are overrepresented in government and nonprofit employment and jobs, and run those organizations. And, as it's always said, last hired, first fired. As soon as these municipal governments are hit up against that wall where they have to begin laying off employees, that would compound the crisis of unemployment that we're seeing in our cities and our states. And then if we are trying to really reopen, if we are trying to win this war against COVID, we've got to make sure that we have the funding in place to stand up a robust public health infrastructure, to continue to undergird small businesses that are run by Black women, which was the largest and fastest growing cohort of small business owners in the United States. Again, being hit by this pandemic, being in compliance with the mandates to shut down, all of that has had an impact on Black women. And so we're hoping that all of these provisions that we know are necessary will prevail in these negotiations, because the initial, I think they call it HEALS Act, that was put out by the Senate was really a disgraceful bill in not recognizing all of these areas that we need to undergird and underpin as a result of the overwhelming compliance that we have had from the American people and Black women in particular. Bless you, darling.
Thank you. No, I think that was a great analysis of the bill and actually how it directly impacts our communities and Black women. As one of the founders and co-chairs of the Caucus of Black Men and Girls, you obviously spend a lot of time thinking through not only how policies impact Black women, but frankly, Black girls. And so, as you know, parents and students are beginning to make their plan to head back to school. Black girls will be heading back to school carrying the trauma of sitting in the midst of death, sickness, joblessness of their parents. And frankly, there's been a discussion around, some of these Black girls being at home, even in abusive homes. So what supports can we be moving on a federal level to help with the mental health of Black women and frankly, Black children and Black students?
Yeah, I mean, there have been a number of provisions put into the HEROES Act that also touched upon the mental health aspect. We've done a lot with respect to the physical health, as much as we could possibly do without being obstructed by those who want to spread propaganda about the realities of living with the COVID virus, right?
Mm-hmm.
We know that not only have those who have come in contact with COVID patients, those who have lost loved ones, and those who are in environments that are dealing with the impact of this, there are a whole host of sort of mental health concerns that just come from having to stay home, whether it's a spike in domestic violence, whether it's street violence, just violence that have been an uptick in violent crimes in many of the communities that we live in, or whether it's, again, like you said, coping with the loss of a loved one and the fear that's generated of being being infected with COVID-19, right? We believe that there needs to be an integrated approach. And unfortunately, there isn't a national approach, but what we can look at is what can be done in various jurisdictions. We know that there are some key elements to healthcare in this COVID era. And one of them is identifying individuals who are positive with the COVID crisis. Along with that comes contact tracing. But what should also come with that are social workers and mental health experts, so that we're dealing with the whole person, not just testing for the virus itself, but testing, the stability of the individual based on their circumstances and what has occurred in their lives. So there needs to be a far more comprehensive approach to the health and well-being of Black women and girls in this moment, given the fact that we know in our communities, we suffer a disparate impact with death and illness as a result of COVID-19. That's something that we have been pushing for, is using that moment, that point of contact, whether it's getting tested or having to go through the process of contact tracing, to do an overall wellness assessment and connect those families with comprehensive services that they need, so that if a child is ambivalent about going back to school, or there is a challenge for that family in determining what is the best way to continue that child's education, whether it's remotely or it's within the classroom setting or a hybrid, how do we provide the wraparound services to enable that? Because for some parents, they are able to stay home and help their child learn remotely. For others, we already know essential workers, their children have had to go into classroom settings that have been set up specifically because they don't have childcare. And so, or the ability to do the remote learning themselves. So, there's a lot of work to be done in that space, Glenda. I don't think we're maximizing on it. And I think that a table like the one that we're setting at this SIP would be a very important group to really raise that up, because the components exist, the cultural sensitivities don't.
Yeah, absolutely. And we are all also concerned about November and the elections, right? Or the election. We in New York have just had our primaries, right? And moved towards making sure those who did not feel safe, actually was encouraged not to go vote in person. But as you know, as a tradition, most of my friends are like, I'm still going to go vote in person. So like making, a safe vote plan as we lead out of the last couple of primaries across this country into our general election. And I know that there's been a conversation, lots of conversation and debate in Washington on what voting is going to look like and what's the investment in reimagining voting during COVID-19. Can you share a little bit about, your efforts, and then kind of the efforts of the Congressional Black Caucus on how do we ensure, literally tomorrow, August 6th is the anniversary of the Voting Rights Act. And so it's literally front in mind that Black women are, prepared to vote, are in the process of making a safe vote plan. And at the end of the day, we want to ensure that our vote counts and that it is protected.
Again, this has been another battle. You would be, it boggles the mind that we're dealing with folks who don't share the value of making sure that every eligible voter in our nation are able to vote. So the pushback around creating a national protocol around voting that keeps people safe and gives them as many options as possible to cast their votes, it is meeting great resistance, particularly in the Senate. In the House of Representatives, we have some folks who clearly don't share the values of the majority, but in the Senate, you have the converse taking place. And as a result of that, we were able to pass in the last COVID-19 stimulus package over $400 million to help, states to stand up a vote by mail operation and to undergird anything they needed in terms of their election commissions to be able to dispense an election day that did not put people's health at risk. But we can see from the various reporting that that was not maximized on in certain jurisdictions around the nation. What we have done with the HEROES Act is, again, put $3 billion on the table to say we need to do a national mail-in voting operation, so that as we see these spikes now taking place across the nation, that people can vote safely from their homes. It's critical. It's critical. And so we have the funding. Do we have the will? And do we have sort of the embrace of this nationwide? I think the voters appreciate it. Many of their representatives are really pushing back, and it's an indication of how voter suppression can transcend the safety and security of one's own constituents. It's unbelievable.
Yeah. And then my last question, I think, is at the end of the day, democracy doesn't begin and end on election day. So as we continue to encourage our community to prepare to vote and vote safe, there's a lot of work that needs to be done leading into November and beyond November. Your office, always provides opportunities for you to connect with your constituency. Can you share just 2 or 3 things that you think those who are watching ought to be doing with their network to ensure that our voices are being heard, not only to our representatives, but the body at whole in Washington as y'all continue to, put forth and debate policies that direct our day-to-day lives?
Yeah, well, I think that we have to understand the urgency and imperative of the moment right now. And Black women, we get the job done. We're always out there. We're working hard. We're engaging people. We are influencers. And if there's one thing I would encourage us to do right now, it's to build momentum towards election day. And one way we can do that is by really drilling down and hammering home the need for us to fill out the census. And I say that because that in a census taking year, the vote and the census are the tools we have to amass and exert the power we have. And if we don't do that in a democracy, particularly one that is being challenged in the way that ours is right now, given all that we have fought for, we just said goodbye, a fond farewell to our dear colleague, the Honorable John Lewis, last week. And it's critical that we understand how to use our power tools and how to use our influence to overwhelm the system, which is what he did in his day, which is what he has bequeathed to all of us to do in our day. And Black women are uniquely positioned to be agents of that level of change. We have to really drill down and get to our people. We need to fill out this census now because they're playing games with that. And then we need to overwhelm the system with our participation, whether it's by mail, early vote, or election day voting, and turnout in record numbers. We need to get our nieces, our nephews, we need to get our children, our grandparents, our great-grandparents. We need to get everybody gassed up, engaged, and unleash this power, because this is the moment we have for transformational change. The table has been set. We need to step up and make sure we're seated at that table.
Absolutely. So thank you so much, Representative Clark. She has given us our marching orders, because Black women, we're going to be counted in the census. Black women vote, and we don't vote alone. We bring our house, our block, our church, and our sorority, and Black women lead. And that is exactly what Congresswoman Yvette Clarke is doing for her constituents and the nation in Washington, including her co-chairs, Representative Robin Kelly and Representative Bonnie Watson Coleman, the 3 founders and co-chair of the Caucus of Black Women and Girls. So thank you once again for coming and providing an all-important briefing about all things happening in Washington, centering Black women and girls and our needs. So thank you so much for your leadership.
Thank you. Thank you for your leadership, Glenda. And I'm in these streets and I'm encouraging every one of us, wear your mask, stay safe, but let's, really make an impression and leave an impression with our community that we mean business and that we will prevail.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm gonna turn it over to Adrian.
Thank you, Glenda. So I'm going to bring in our other guests into the conversation right now, Jocelyn Fry, who is a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, and Rebecca Dixon, who is the executive director at the National Employment Law Center. And I'm glad that the Congresswoman actually covered a lot, both in terms of helping us to understand the impact of the legislation that's been before Congress on Black women, also for clarifying for us that the Congress is on recess. And so I wanted to take a minute with you all to talk about what that means exactly. There was a lot of legislation that was introduced, some passed in the Congress, all dead at the Senate. But there was a lot of it. Everything from, of course, the HEROES Act, the CARES Act that sort of predated that. There was the Justice and Policing Act. There was the Paycheck Protection Program. All of those things that we heard about, some with more and less impact. And for our community, there was a lot less impact. But I wanted to take a second and dig in with the two of you for a second, because in walking away and going back to their districts, what that left undone are real, serious economic policies and resources that are not going to go out the door to people who are literally struggling right now, who don't know what tomorrow is going to hold for them in very real ways. And so I wanted to just maybe talk a little bit with the both of you about, what this all means for unemployment benefits. There's this whole sort of push to get workers to go back to work for a whole host of bad reasons, and at the same time, trying to provide this kind of employer liability cover so that employers are off the hook when their employees rush back to their places of work and get sick, right? So can you each talk to us a little bit about kind of where we are, what this means, how are people going to survive in this moment where there is so much uncertainty and feeling like people are just falling right off the cliff? And so why don't we start with you, Jocelyn, and then Rebecca, you can add your thoughts as well.
Well, thank you for the question, and you're absolutely right. There's a lot. There's a lot going on, and a lot to be said. I think your comment really summed it up. Congress is, they've gone on recess, and they're fine. They have pay. They can take time if they get sick. They have protections. They have all of the things that many folks in this country, including Black women, often don't have. And really, that's why they're there. They have one job, which is to actually do the work of the people. And right now, they're not getting the work done, and we're paying the price. And all of that legislation that you talked about, some of which has been really critical. CARES Act, the First Families Act, Paycheck Protection, all of those things, and certainly the House measures that have been passed, like the HEROES Act, all speak to an urgent need. Many of those needs existed long before any of us ever heard of the coronavirus. But what has happened is that this incredible public health emergency has laid bare gaps that have been there forever, whether it is in access to things like paid leave, inadequacies in terms of protections for essential workers, low wages. Like there are a myriad of things that have impacted the ability of Black women in particular, but communities of color more broadly, to be economically secure. And the coronavirus has exacerbated it. And certainly there have been legislative measures to respond, but quite frankly, there is more to do. And we know that communities are struggling. Black women are struggling. They are on the front lines. They are disproportionately essential workers. They are also more likely to be breadwinners. If you look at Black mothers, they are the most likely to be breadwinners in comparison to all other mothers. And they need help. And they need Congress to act and not go home on a respite because they're tired.
Right.
They have a hard job to do, to be sure, but this is hard for everybody. And we need Congress to actually do the work that is necessary to make sure that people can survive.
Yeah. And Rebecca, will you weigh in here and talk a little bit about, because I think that there's some confusion, and there has been since the beginning, right, about unemployment benefits in particular. Can you weigh in a little bit on just on the overall question that I asked at the beginning, but specifically about what this means for people who've been relying on these benefits and now they're not there?
It's like you said, we have folks who are falling off a cliff. We're talking about up to 2/3 of a family's income being cut off immediately. And this is like, combined with the expiration of the moratoriums on rent, not being evicted, and, the limits of mortgage help. So all of those things are expiring at the same time. Plus, we know that Black women are in these low-paid jobs and that they have, historically not been able to save. And so they're in a position where they don't have savings to rely on, and we're just taking away this resource immediately. And it's kind of like a downward spiral because the UI benefits are also bolstering the economy and keeping folks employed. Something like 3 million jobs are being boosted by these UI benefits. So you're going to see some of these essential workers being laid off because the economy is going to contract. So by not acting, Congress is just making this whole thing worse. And you mentioned earlier this immunity, which is tied to the UI, right? So we want to Congress is seeming to want to force people back to work in unsafe conditions. We know that a lot of states are seeing an uptick in cases of COVID and things are closing back up, and they are working to use this immunity issue where they want to give employers blanket immunity for any responsibility for having a safe and healthy workplace. And what that basically would lead to is a race to the bottom. So if I'm a good employer and I'm doing health and safety things in my business, I'm competing against companies that are not. So you're setting in motion something that's even worse for workers when they actually don't have a lot of ways to actually get to the courthouse as it is, given all of the things that they have to sign when they take a job that say you're going to go to arbitration or you can't be part of a class action. So they're already barred from the courthouse in a lot of ways. And we know that the Occupational Health and Safety Administration has not shown up in this crisis to issue a mandatory enforceable health and safety guideline. So we're sort of working on the honor system for employers. And so even if an employee is not successful in a lawsuit, it is a way to hold employers accountable. And we have seen that in this case where some workers who were in danger were able to file a lawsuit and get safety measures put in place, even though the lawsuit was ultimately not successful.
Yeah, I mean, Jocelyn, you talked about there have always been these gaps, right? These historic gaps that are linked to this thing called systemic racism from our vantage point. But there are all these connections, and there is this sort of, as this push to reopen happens, there are all these other pieces that I know that at least the House Democrats have tried to address, right? Whether that is childcare, which is also very much linked to sort of this push to demand that schools open back up, and punishing schools, or the threats of punishing schools that start virtually. But talk to us a little bit about what the impact is of all of those things also on families, because people have to make a decision, right? There's a whole host of decisions that folks have to make as they're trying to figure out how they're going to pay their rent, right? About what it means when the businesses are reopening and for them have to get back to work. That includes questions around school. It includes questions around childcare and the investment that the House just made to invest in childcare.
Well, we know a couple of things. As I said, long before coronavirus, there were some things that we knew to be true. One was that Black women have the highest labor force participation historically, and that has been true for decades by and large. We also know that the influx of women in the workforce generally has been critical both for the increase in our GDP and overall economy, but also, our ability for employers to be more productive. But the impact of women working is that you also need to manage work and family responsibilities. Women, whether you're talking about Black women or women across the board, they're disproportionately more likely to be the caregivers in their families. So there are responsibilities they have at home just to either care for children or older relatives, or if they get sick, or just manage sort of the day-to-day. And what we know historically is that one of the reasons that women generally, and Black women specifically, earn less than their male counterparts, and in particular white men, is in part because women are dealing with all these other responsibilities, and their employers often do not have policies like paid leave, paid sick days, and allow them the flexibility necessary to both manage their work and also manage their caregiving responsibilities. So that was true before, and now the coronavirus sort of blew that up in a way that is, incredibly difficult. And you hit the nail right on the head. What are people supposed to do? Their kids are out of school, they're at home, and now, they're supposed to try to go to work, but what does that mean exactly? And it's particularly challenging for Black women because they're far more likely to be breadwinners, they're more likely to be single heads of household, and their families disproportionately rely on their income, even if they're in married families. So all of those things are impacting families. And what we need to do, there are a range of things, but certainly making sure that Black women aren't penalized if they need to take time off to care for their families. That there were paid leave provisions in the original COVID bill, but it wasn't sufficient. And there are lots of people, almost 100 million workers, who were excluded from those paid leave protections. The HEROES Act would fix some of that, but we clearly need those types of protections. But we also need the investment in childcare, and the House just passed a $50 billion proposed investment in childcare. And that's because our childcare facilities have been decimated. They need money to make sure they can open safely. Many of them just don't have the infrastructure to operate safely. They need to be available for essential workers who are being forced to go to work. And they also need investments so that people can actually afford childcare, right? So all of those things are necessary and critical for Black women, and they have to be front and center if we reasonably want to reopen and get people back to work.
Yeah. And Rebecca, can you talk? We like to think of our Wednesday Power Brunch as a call to action. You heard Glenda ask Congresswoman Clark, what can folks do around voting and to make sure that we're moving toward mobilizing our community for the election. And in this case, I want to ask, because you talked a little bit about safety standards, and what kinds of things. So I have two questions maybe around what people can do. So one is if folks are have been receiving unemployment benefits and or know someone who's been receiving unemployment benefits and are worried, what is it that they can do? What is it that they should do? And then the other, I think, is, there's on the sort of advocacy side, there's the, pushing for, in the midst of this pandemic, right? This is a moment for us to think about what are standardized safety standards, right? And so are there things that folks can be doing locally to ensure that workers are protected on the in their work sites? And then the other is, what should folks do who are worried, and rightfully so?
So in terms of unemployment benefits, those who are worried really should, so if they've been called back to work, there are several things to consider. So if they are receiving, there's a certain part of the unemployment insurance package, the federal package that was in the CARES Act, that covers needing to be home to take care of children. So if that is why you're home and your job tries to call you back, that's a provision that you can take advantage of. If you're not able to take advantage of that provision and you're concerned about safety and health at the job, what we need workers to do is actually go to the job and speak up about that. So it's not enough to be worried and not go. And then if the employer then doesn't do anything, they may then be able to continue to stay on their unemployment benefits, but they really do need to check with their state to make sure, because all of the states have different rules around this. And then in terms of what are workers, what's being done to get healthy and safe safety and health standards. And what we're seeing is that workers are actually walking off the job. Workers are banding together. They are joining together and using their power and demanding a safe and healthy workplace. And we need to be backing them up and supporting them. We are seeing that because the federal government has not issued standards, we are seeing states issuing rules and standards to protect workers. Virginia recently passed legislation, a pretty comprehensive piece of legislation to put in place enforceable safety standards. And I think, one of the things that is not so apparent is when I participated in a hearing around this, a congressional hearing around this, one of the things that came out around unemployment and immunity is that if workers are actually, so if employers are actually doing what they're supposed to do, following the safety standards, then they have that as a defense if they are sued. And the fact that we don't have safety standards is hurting everyone. So hurting workers and hurting places of business.
Yeah. Thank you. That's really helpful. And Jocelyn, just really quickly as we close, Congress is on recess. It doesn't mean they're on vacation. So what can people do to make sure that they are pushing their their members of Congress, whether they are in the House or in the Senate, to get back to work and get these bills passed and help to support the American people?
Well, you're absolutely right. They are on recess, but they should not be vacationing. And I think, everybody who is listening in and, anybody who cares about these issues ought to make their voices heard. They ought to weigh in with their member of Congress and other members of Congress who work on these issues and let them know that these issues are important. And it's not enough simply to, sort of talk rhetorically about supporting families. They actually need to take action and do something concretely that will have real impact. And there's an opportunity for them to do something, and they should make this their top priority. We are not anywhere past this crisis. We are in the midst of it. We are struggling, and we need them to do their job, and people should say that.
Right. So you heard it here first. Call your Congress members. They are not on vacation. They just might not be in Washington, D.C., and let them know that we need them for the bills that are left languishing that could have real serious impact on changing people's lives for the moment, that we need for them to get back to business and get those bills passed. And particularly if you live in a state where there are senators who are uncooperative, and in fact, at this point, dangers to the American people. It would be great if you are living in one of those states, and even if you are not living in one of those states, they still represent the United States of America in the U.S. Senate. Call them anyway, whether you're in their state or not, and let them know that they need to do their jobs and protect the American people. So thank you both so much for joining us today. This is obviously an ongoing conversation, because you're right, Jocelyn, we are nowhere near out of it. So we will look forward to you all coming back and sharing with us again. I'm going to bring back in our co-hosts Judith Brown-Dianis and Glenda Carr, and we're going to transition and talk about other things that are happening out there in the world, including an election that we had just yesterday.
Hey, so good to be back, rested up and ready to go So we're going to dive into some hot topics because there's a lot of stuff to talk about with my girls here. So we're gonna keep for a while on some hot topics. So want to start? Yes, yesterday was a primary, and I want to dive into Missouri in particular. Missouri is a place where Black women just like won last night.
And the table, yeah.
We just held it down. And both for local and for congressional seats, unseating Congressman Lacey, who had been there for quite some time. And now we have a new person who's probably going to win in November, a Black woman, Cori Bush. Adrienne, Glenda, let's weigh in on this. I mean, first I want to say, before you all say something, like one thing I want to give out to are all the organizers in St. Louis, the energy and the organizing that's been done by groups like Action St. Louis and others. Mike Brown has died. They really have changed the political equation in St. Louis. So y'all tell me what your thoughts are on what happened there, because Cori Bush is a progressive woman who's a nurse, who is an activist. So what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're seeing in this moment, and it's been a moment for several cycles, you see more women of color, and frankly, the work that we do with Higher Heights, more Black women running, and they come to these elections as candidates and to decision-making tables as elected officials. They bring their qualifications and their lived experiences. So you see not only just the diversity of the candidates that are running since 2016 for gender and race and ethnicity, you actually see diversity in their backgrounds. And so, Cori Bush, if elected in the general election, will join Lauren Underwood, another nurse and public health professional. And so having those varied experiences at decision-making tables, particularly during a global pandemic, provides, the lived experience and the expertise and qualifications, I think, to make better decision-making tables. Also, as it relates to the end of the day, you are seeing more, as they're called, challengers to incumbents being victorious on election day. And I think that is the moment that we're living in. And so you see races like the one in St. Louis with a backdrop of COVID-19. So campaigns look different. You had to organize and engage voters in a different way, both virtual, and give them the tools they needed and the information they needed to vote in a global pandemic, either by mail or in person. And at the end of the day, our recent poll points to that voters are looking for a new generation of leaders, and that new generation leaders are being ushered in a way that this moment has created, right? So you enter in COVID-19 that created literally a standstill of our economy. And then in May, the continuing tipping point of the attack on Blackness and those hitting the streets and the social media streets protesting, I think has created the environment for candidates like Cori Bush and others to seize this moment.
So let me just say that, like, this is a tectonic shift, right? Like this is, Congressman Clay, obviously held the seat for a while, has been a fixture in terms of the Congressional Black Caucus, but his father held the seat before him, and in fact was a founder of the CBC. So this is a big shift. That I think that, and I know that, CBC members have been fending off competitors, right, to a lot of the incumbents that are in the CBC.
She ran against him before.
Yes, that's right.
She's also been a candidate. She's actually run, this is her third time. She ran for U.S. Senate, then she ran for Congress against Lacey Clay, and then she ran this time.
Right, but so the last time, that's right, but he beat her last time by 20 points, right? So that's, I mean, that the closing that gap is a result of many of the dynamics that Glenda spoke to. I mean, I think there's a way in which the CBC has to look at these losses and the other races that have been close races over the last couple of cycles, and really think about what it means to support this emerging set of leaders and making room and making way for them. The other thing that I think that's important, in addition to the congressional race that Corey won and Tashara's win as well, is that Missouri voters passed Medicaid expansion last night as well. And so I think that too, I mean, we worked in Missouri, Black PAC worked in Missouri in 2018, and while it was tough on candidates, some really important policy propositions passed. And I think that we're seeing really voters saying that there are issues that matter. And if our legislators aren't going to address these issues, then the voters themselves will take it into their own hands to address the healthcare and economic concerns that are plaguing our community. So Missouri had a big night last night.
The district attorney's race also, I mean, and I think it is a huge shift for a place like St. Louis in particular, because the politics are shifting left. The people want something different. I think that's right about the CBC, just as well as the Democratic Party generally, has got to start thinking about, are we keeping up with the times, right?
And be frank, that is Republican and Democratic Party. I mean, there have been some Republican incumbents that have had tough challenges and or have lost. So at the end of the day, all Americans are looking for leadership they can trust, leadership that can pivot during these times. I shared this week at the end of the day, you know, some of the backlash on how people, particularly how I would say white men in particular, are reacting to the increase in women's leadership, in Black women's leadership, is they recognize that they're at the brink of extinction. And I don't think they, you know, it is the changing times and the different types of women in particular that are running. But at the end of the day, these, you know, a healthy democracy denotes that elected officials should actually have challengers. And it is also digging in as a challenger and shifting and being in constant communication with your constituency and bringing those needs and those voices to Washington that could ward off, you know, losing on election day. And so I think 18 was the beginning of that conversation, that reckoning. And if you didn't get it in 18, I think there's a clear signal to incumbents, both on a local level and on a national level. They ought to, you know, continue to shift how they lead, how they govern, and how they campaign.
I think Glenda raises a great point. I just want to make this one last point about about this being true on the Republican side too. So you had a number of Republican women of color who won their primaries over the course of this primary season. And so it'll be important to see if they bring the lived experiences of their community into the legislative arena and where they sort of land in terms of priorities that are issue priorities that are important to us. They also elected some QAnon folks, so you know, I don't know how.
Yeah, so for folks who didn't see our show on Sunday, I really would say to tune in. You can go back on all of our channels to watch the discussion about the Black woman as a VP candidate. And this discussion is heating up, and sisters are like, not on our watches, that you're going to be talking about we're too ambitious, we rub you the wrong way. You know, and I think this St. Louis wins, right, also just shows that Black women are ready, Black women are qualified, and that voters are voting for Black women. So, so that's really important. So anything new on the VP from either of you?
It continues.
All right. Apparently we will know next week. But
Yeah, there has
I will say that the important thing about this is, I mean, the suspense and all of that is important. And there's a lot of women that we all love that we would hope that it was any one of them, right? At this point, when as the reporting says who the top 3 are. But I also think that it is that point that you just made, Judith, should not be lost on anyone, is an important one about the ways in which Black women are being attacked right now. And not just about ambition, but characterizing Black women and the Black women who are in consideration with characterizing them in racist ways that are not lost on anyone. And it is, you know, it is
People didn't hear about that, the Aunt Jemima reference.
exactly. Yep, that's
I
right.
mean, it's just, it's amazing that in the moment that we're in, which I guess, and it's not maybe amazing, we're in a moment where America's having a big reckoning around race, and the people who are just straight up racist white supremacists are still being themselves, right? And but it just feels kind of out of tune with everything else that's going on, and they are very stuck in their ways. They might find out over the next year or so that a lot of Americans are not with them, right? I mean, when you see people, I mean, oh, in Portland, no, ain't a lot of Black people in Portland, right? But when you see all those people on the streets, ready to take a hit, you know, shit's changing. Oh, sorry. Oops, curse.
I didn't even notice it.
You talking about Black women, I gotta talk about the Queen, Beyonce. Did y'all see it? I spent an hour and a half of my life watching it, and it was beautiful. It was just beautiful. And my favorite song is Move Forever. And I swear when I get out this house after this pandemic, I'm gonna be in a mood forever. It was just, did either of you see it yet?
I watched.
Adrian.
I did not watch. I didn't finish it. I didn't understand. I have to say, I thought it was beautiful.
You don't have to understand it. Just enjoy it.
It was beautiful. I love the visual. I like the idea of the visual album. I loved all of that. My kids loved it. I didn't really get it. I know, I'm sorry. I'm a bad Beyonce fan. I try.
You're hip and paired, as they say. Glenda, did you see it yet?
Linda?
No, Adrian and I said both weren't gonna see it, and then she went to see it. I haven't seen it yet.
Okay. Well, watch it.
I'll have comments when
My
Tracy's
second
back.
time around, because I have to, you know, I'm sure I missed some things, so I'm on my second time around.
I'll watch it again.
Okay, so we'll talk about it on Friday, on the show on Friday. So, Glenda, what are we doing on Friday?
Judy missed the